The 7-foot Comanche warrior knelt in the dust outside her ranch house, his voice carrying across the stillness like a prayer made of desperation. "Give me work. I give you strong children." Evangeline Copperfield stood on her porch, rifle steady in weathered hands. The morning sun cast long shadows between them, painting the courtyard in shades of amber and threat. Her ranch hands had frozen mid-motion, water buckets suspended, rope coiled halfway. The world held its breath. Dust swirled around the kneeling giant. His braided hair touched the earth where her cattle had once grazed thick. Now the pasture stretched brown and brittle, a testament to the drought that had been bleeding her dry for 8 months. The irony wasn't lost on her. A Comanche warrior begging for work on land his people once claimed as their own. She studied his face. No paint, no feathers, just hunger carved into sharp cheekbones and eyes that had seen too much. His clothes were a mix of white man's cotton and traditional leather, both worn thin. Whatever pride had brought him here, it was the kind that bent rather than broke. "You got a name, or should I just call you Giant?" "Tall Bear Walking." His voice held no shame, despite his position. "You are the Widow Copperfield." The title stung. 6 months since they'd buried Marcus, and the word still felt like a brand. She'd been many things before. Daughter of a freed slave who'd bought his own land in Georgia. Wife to a man who'd promised her an empire in New Mexico territory. Now she was just another woman trying to hold onto what the desert wanted to take back. "I am." Her foreman, Dutch Peterson, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. His hand rested casual on his gun belt, ready for trouble. The other hands watched with the careful attention men gave to rattlesnakes and storm clouds. "Ma'am," Dutch said, "you want me to run him off?" Evie kept her eyes on the warrior. Something in his stillness reminded her of herself those first weeks after the funeral. The way you had to hold yourself together when everything inside was coming apart. "What kind of work you looking for?" Tall Bear's head lifted slightly. "I know water, where it hides, where it runs deep." His gaze swept her dying pasture. "Your cattle are thirsty." The words hit like a physical blow. Her cattle were more than thirsty. They were dying. 40 head lost last month alone, their bones bleaching white under the relentless sun. The creek that had drawn Marcus to this valley had run dry in July. The well was dropping daily. She had maybe 3 months before the bank came calling, and Clayton Grimm would be first in line with his predatory smile and lowball offers. "And what's this about children?" Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something deeper than desperation. "Strong children come from strong alliances. Your people, my people. Together we survive what alone would kill us." Dutch laughed, harsh and quick. "Lady, this savage is talking about breeding stock." Tall Bear's eyes went cold as winter stone, but he didn't rise from his knees. "I speak of the future, not what you think." The words hung in the air like smoke. Evie felt her pulse quicken. The audacity of it, the impossible scandal it would bring. A black woman and a Comanche warrior in a territory where both their people were barely tolerated on the best of days. But beneath the shock was something else. Curiosity, maybe even hope. The drought had taken more than her cattle. It had taken her options. The other ranchers whispered behind her back about the uppity widow who thought she could run an empire. The bank measured her worth in failing numbers. The town treated her like a temporary problem that would solve itself when she inevitably gave up and moved back east. None of them knew about the second mortgage Marcus had taken out behind her back. None of them knew about the debts that would come due when winter ended. She'd been holding onto this place through sheer will and careful lies about her financial situation. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you have what I need. And I have what you need." "Which is?" "Water." The single word carried weight. In this territory, water meant everything. Cattle, crops, life itself. If he really knew where to find it, if he could save what remained of her herd. "Where are your people?" "Hidden, waiting." "How many?" "Enough to work your land proper, not enough to threaten your neighbor's sleep." She almost smiled at that. Her neighbors already lost sleep over her mere existence. A Comanche workforce would send them straight to apoplexy. The morning breeze picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust and something else. Rain, maybe, though the sky showed no mercy in its endless blue. Her cattle moved restless in the distance, searching for grass that wasn't there. Marcus would have shot first and asked questions later, but Marcus was buried on the hill overlooking the valley he'd loved and lost. She was the one left to salvage what remained. "I don't need children," she said finally. "I need results." Tall Bear nodded slowly. "Then I offer you work, good work, fair trade." Dutch stepped forward. "Ma'am, you can't seriously be considering this." She was considering it, more than considering it. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the scandal, the danger, the sheer impossibility of it all. But desperation had a way of making the impossible look practical. "What's your experience with cattle?" "I know animals, I know land, I learn quick." "You understand I'm not running a charity here. I understand you are running out of time." The blunt honesty of it hit her like cold water. He'd sized up her situation as easily as reading tracks in mud. The failed pastures, the thin cattle, the careful way she'd been rationing feed and hope in equal measure. "1 month trial," she heard herself say. "Foreman wages. You prove you can find water, we'll talk about permanent work." Dutch's face went white. "Ma'am, I've been foreman here 3 years." "You've been drawing foreman pay," she corrected. "But you haven't found me any water." Tall Bear rose from his knees in one fluid motion, unfolding like morning shadow. Standing, he towered over them all, yet somehow seemed less threatening than when he'd been kneeling. Desperation made everything dangerous. Hope strangely made things possible. "I will not disappoint you. See that you don't." She turned toward the house, rifle still in hand. Behind her, she could hear Dutch muttering under his breath and the other hands shifting nervous. Change was coming to the Copperfield Ranch, whether they liked it or not. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the kind of change that saved them all. Tall Bear led her into the canyon at dawn, their horses picking careful paths through stone that held the night's coolness. Evie had barely slept, turning over the madness of what she'd agreed to. Behind them, Dutch rode silent as judgment itself. The canyon walls rose red and weathered, carved by water that had run here when the world was young. Tall Bear moved through the narrow passages with the certainty of a man reading his own name. No hesitation, no second-guessing the path. Here. He dismounted beside what looked like solid rock. Evie saw nothing but more of the endless stone that had swallowed her hopes all summer. Then Tall Bear pressed his palm against a particular section of canyon wall. Water seeped between his fingers, not a trickle, a flow. "Underground spring," he said, "feeds down into your valley. Been blocked by rockfall maybe 2 years." Dutch spat. "If there was water here, we'd have found it." Tall Bear's eyes held steady on the older man. "You found what you were looking for. I look for what is." The distinction cut deep. Evie thought of all the places they'd dug wells, all the spots Marcus had chosen based on old maps and wishful thinking. They'd been looking for what should be there. Tall Bear had found what was. By midday they'd cleared enough rock to let the spring run free. Water carved a new path down the canyon floor, following gravity toward her dying pasture. The sound of it was music she'd forgotten existed. "How did you know?" she asked. Tall Bear knelt beside the stream, cupping water in his palms. "My grandmother taught me to listen. Stone talks if you know its language." Something in his voice made her study his face more carefully. This wasn't just practical knowledge. This was sacred ground, ancestral wisdom being shared with a stranger who happened to need it. "Why help me?" "Because you did not shoot first." The simple truth of it settled between them. In a territory where most encounters between their peoples ended in blood, she'd offered work instead of violence. The gesture had meant more than she'd realized. They rode back as the sun reached its peak. Her cattle had already found the new stream, clustering along its banks with the desperate gratitude of the dying reprieved. The sight loosened something tight in her chest. That evening, as Dutch settled the books, Tall Bear approached the porch where she sat watching her herd drink their fill. "There are more springs," he said, "higher up, enough water for twice the cattle you have now. And what would that cost me? Work for my people." There it was, the bargain she'd sensed from the beginning. Not just his labor, but a larger alliance. Her ranch as sanctuary for survivors who had nowhere else to go. How many people? 30, maybe 40. Her hands tightened on the porch rail. 40 displaced Comanche on her land would bring every soldier and settler in 3 counties down on her head. The territorial government had made their position clear. Reservation or grave. No middle ground. They can't stay as Comanche. Tall Bear nodded slow. We understand. Mexican vaqueros looking for work. It has been done before. The deception would be fragile as morning frost. One wrong word, one recognized face, and they'd all pay the price. But the alternative was watching her ranch die while his people starved in hidden canyons. They know cattle. They know survival. The rest they will learn. Over the following days, they came in small groups, men with calloused hands and careful eyes, women who could read weather in the way grass bent, children who moved quiet as shadows and watched everything. Evie watched Tall Bear transform into something between war chief and ranch foreman. He spoke to his people in their own language, quick and low, but his instructions were practical. How to handle cattle bred for beef instead of buffalo hunting. How to speak just enough Spanish to sell the disguise. How to avoid the town entirely. Rosa, an older woman with silver braids, became her unofficial translator. Her English came stilted but clear. We make no trouble for you, Rosa said. Tall Bear says you are good woman, fair woman. I'm a desperate woman, Evie replied. That's different. Rosa's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile. Same thing, sometimes. The work came together with surprising speed. Her new hands knew land in ways that humbled her. They read signs she couldn't see, found grazing spots Dutch had missed, gentled spooked cattle with patience born of necessity. But it was during the roundup of strays that everything changed. They'd found the last of her scattered herd in a box canyon, 20 head that had wandered off to die alone. As they worked to drive the cattle home, Tall Bear pulled his horse close to hers. Your husband, he said quietly. He did not die by accident. The words hit her like physical blows. What are you talking about? The night he died. I was hunting rabbits in the hills above your house. I saw Clayton Grimm leave your barn. Saw your husband's horse running wild. Saw Grimm ride to town to report finding the body. The world tilted sideways. Marcus, thrown from his horse during a routine evening check of the stock. A tragic accident, everyone said. Bad luck that happened to good men who worked dangerous country. You saw Clayton kill him. I saw Clayton leave him. Whether the fall killed him or Grimm finished the job, I cannot say. But it was no accident. Her hands shook on the reins. Clayton Grimm, with his banker's smile and helpful offers to buy her out for far less than the land was worth. Clayton Grimm, who'd been so understanding about extending her loan deadlines while systematically tightening the noose. Why didn't you tell someone? Tall Bear's expression held depths of old pain. Who would believe a Comanche's word against a white banker's? Who would care about justice for a black man's widow? The brutal honesty of it cut straight through her rage to the bone-deep truth underneath. In this territory, justice was a luxury reserved for people who looked like Clayton Grimm. Everyone else got whatever mercy they could scrape together. Why tell me now? Because now you have family to help you fight. Family. The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Not the family of blood and birth, but the family of choice and necessity. The kind that formed when survival demanded alliance between people the world said should be enemies. That night, she stood on her porch watching the lights in the bunkhouse where her new hands settled in for sleep. 40 people who trusted her enough to risk everything on her word. 40 people whose lives now depended on her ability to hold this deception together. Dutch emerged from the barn, his expression troubled. Ma'am, there's talk in town. People wondering about your sudden good fortune. About your new hands. What kind of talk? The kind that brings visitors, the unwelcome sort. Her stomach dropped. Interest from townspeople meant questions she couldn't answer, questions that would unravel everything they'd built. But as she looked out over her recovering ranch, at cattle growing fat on good grass and clean water, at people who'd found safety in her willingness to take risks. She felt something she hadn't experienced since Marcus died. Hope. Dangerous, complicated, potentially deadly hope, but hope nonetheless. The kind worth fighting for. Spring came early to the Copperfield Ranch, painting the valley in shades of green that had been missing for 2 years. The cattle grew fat on new grass. The books showed black ink for the first time since Marcus died. Evie should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt sick every morning. The nausea hit her as she stepped out to check the dawn roundup. Tall Bear was already mounted, directing the hands with gestures more than words. His people had learned to move through their work invisible as morning mist. Even Dutch had grudgingly admitted they knew their business. But the sickness in her belly wasn't from pride or relief. It was the kind that came with consequences she couldn't hide much longer. Tall Bear's eyes found hers across the yard. Something in her face made him dismount and approach the porch. His steps were careful, reading her mood in the set of her shoulders. "You are unwell." Not a question. An observation that cut straight to the truth she'd been avoiding for 3 months. The truth that would complicate everything they'd built. "I'm fine." He studied her with the same intensity he brought to reading water signs in stone. "You have been sick in the mornings for 2 weeks. You eat little. You wear loose clothing." Heat flooded her cheeks. Of course he'd noticed. A man who survived by reading sign would see what she'd been trying to hide from herself. "It's not your concern. If it affects this ranch, it is my concern. If it affects you, it is my concern." The quiet certainty in his voice made something tight in her chest loosen. When was the last time anyone had claimed concern for her welfare? Since Marcus died, she'd been a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. Not a person whose well-being mattered. That evening, she found herself alone with him in the barn as they checked on a mare close to foaling. The space felt smaller with his presence filling it, more intimate than the wide-open ranges where they usually worked together. "The child is your husband's," she jerked as if slapped. "What makes you think there's a child at all? Rosa has eyes. Rosa has experience. Rosa told me to prepare for changes." Of course Rosa had seen through her careful deceptions. A woman who'd raised children in hiding would recognize the signs another woman tried to conceal. "So what happens now?" Evie's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You going to withdraw your people? Find safer ground?" Tall Bear was quiet for a long moment, his hands gentle on the mare's neck. "Among my people, children belong to the tribe. They are everyone's responsibility, everyone's future. This child won't be Comanche. This child will be part of what we are building here." The words settled over her wounds. She'd spent months terrified that pregnancy would make her vulnerable, that creditors would see a woman with child as easier prey, that the community they'd formed would fragment under the weight of additional complications. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you careful. Carelessness gets people killed." His bluntness should have stung. Instead, it felt reassuring. No false comfort or empty promises, just acknowledgement that danger was real and preparation was survival. "When Rosa had her first child, we were running from cavalry," he continued. "Winter camp, not enough food, no safe place to stop. The baby came during a blizzard while soldiers camped 2 miles away." "What happened?" "Rosa birthed her daughter in silence. The whole tribe stayed silent until the soldiers moved on. The child learned early that survival sometimes means being invisible." Evie pressed her hand to her still flat belly. A child who would grow up between worlds, claimed by neither fully. Mixed blood in a territory that had little mercy for anything that didn't fit neat categories. "Your original proposal," she said, "about strong children. This is what you meant, isn't it? Not just breeding stock, something bigger. Children who can move between worlds, who speak multiple languages, who understand that strength comes from adaptation, not just tradition." The vision he painted was radical beyond anything she'd imagined. A generation raised without the rigid barriers that kept their peoples separate and weak. Children who could be equally comfortable with Comanche wisdom and territorial politics, who could build bridges instead of walls. It would be dangerous for them. Everything is dangerous. The question is whether the danger serves a purpose. Over the following days, she began to see the ranch differently, not just as a business venture or even a sanctuary, but as something unprecedented. A place where two decimated peoples were creating something entirely new. The signs were subtle. Tom, one of the younger Comanche men, teaching Dutch how to read weather patterns in cloud formations. Maria, Rose's daughter, learning to keep books while teaching Evie's cook how to preserve meat using traditional methods. Languages mixing in the bunkhouse where Spanish, English, and Comanche created a dialect that belonged to no single culture. But the growing success brought unwelcome attention. Clayton Grimm rode out on a Thursday afternoon, accompanied by two other men Evie didn't recognize. His smile was as polished as his boots, and twice as false. "Mrs. Copperfield, remarkable recovery you've made here." "Quite remarkable. Good water and hard work," she replied. "Amazing what they can accomplish." "Indeed, though I confess I'm curious about your workforce. Several of my associates have commented on their unusual efficiency." Her pulse quickened. Grimm's associates would be other ranchers, other businessmen, people with eyes sharp enough to see through careful disguises if they looked too closely. "Good workers are hard to find. I was fortunate." "Quite fortunate. Tell me, where exactly did you find such skilled vaqueros?" The question hung in the air heavy as storm clouds. Behind Grimm, his companion studied her hands working cattle with professional interest. The kind of interest that asked uncomfortable questions about techniques that seemed more suited to hunting buffalo than herding beef. "South Texas," she said, "came up looking for better wages." "Fascinating. Perhaps I should ride down that way myself, always in need of good help." The threat was politely veiled but unmistakable. Grimm was probing, testing her story for cracks. If he found them, he'd use them to destroy everything they'd built. That night, Tall Bear found her on the porch staring out at the valley that had become home to so many people with nowhere else to go. "He knows," she said without preamble. "He suspects. Knowing requires proof." "What do we do?" Tall Bear settled beside her on the porch steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, close enough that his presence steadied her racing heart. "We get stronger faster than he gets proof." "How?" "By giving him bigger problems than us to worry about." She turned to study his profile in the starlight. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that come when a man's past catches up with his present." The words carried weight that made her pulse quicken. Not just survival anymore, but active defense. Not just hiding, but fighting back. That's dangerous. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. His hand found hers in the darkness, large enough to engulf her fingers completely, calloused from years of hard work, warm with life and possibility. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Evie felt something other than fear about the future. She felt hope. Dangerous, complicated, revolutionary hope. The kind that built new worlds from the ashes of old ones. The kind that created strong children in more ways than one. Clayton Grimm arrived at dawn with 3 riders and a leather satchel that meant business. Evie watched from her window as they approached, her hand instinctively moving to her belly, where the child was beginning to show despite her loose clothing. Tall Bear appeared at the barn door, his presence drawing the attention of every hand on the ranch. The morning air grew thick with unspoken tension. Even the cattle seemed to sense the shift, clustering closer to the water troughs. "Mrs. Copperfield." Grimm's voice carried the false warmth of a snake in sunshine. "I'm afraid we need to discuss some irregularities." She stepped onto the porch, rifle within easy reach. "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that involve harboring fugitives from federal authority." The words hit the morning air sharp as gunshots. Behind Grimm, his men shifted in their saddles, hands casual near their weapons. This wasn't a social call, this was a reckoning. "I'm not harboring anyone, I'm running a cattle ranch." With displaced Comanche passing themselves off as Mexican vaqueros. Grimm opened his satchel, pulling out official-looking papers. "I have witness statements, territorial authority, and a 48-hour ultimatum." Evie's blood turned to ice water. What are you talking about? You have 2 days to turn over the fugitives to federal custody, or I'll bring in the cavalry to collect them myself. His smile was all teeth and malice. Of course, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. The threat hung in the air heavy as smoke. Cavalry meant indiscriminate violence, meant the kind of justice that didn't distinguish between the guilty and anyone standing too close. And if I comply, well, that depends on how reasonable you're feeling about other matters. Your loan, for instance, the one that comes due next month. There it was, the real trap: destroy her people or lose her land. Either way, Grimm won everything he'd been maneuvering to take since Marcus died. You killed my husband. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Grimm's expression never changed, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Tragic accident, though I suppose grief makes people say all sorts of irrational things. Tall Bear saw you leave the barn that night. The word of a savage against a respected businessman. Grimm's laugh was dry as desert wind. Even if anyone believed such nonsense, your witness will be in federal custody by week's end. Or dead. Either way, his testimony becomes irrelevant. The casual mention of murder made her stomach clench. Not just the threat to Tall Bear, but the implication that she'd been living on borrowed time since the moment she'd agreed to help him. What do you want? Your signature on a deed transfer. Fair market value, of course. Enough to start over somewhere more suitable for a woman in your condition. Heat flooded her face. He knew about the pregnancy, had probably known longer than she'd admitted it to herself. Another piece of leverage in his carefully constructed trap. I need time to consider. 48 hours, not a minute more. After Grimm rode away, the ranch fell into unnatural quiet, the kind that preceded storms or funerals. Evie found Tall Bear by the creek, staring into water that ran clear over stones worn smooth by time. How long have you known this was coming? Since the day I knelt in your dirt. His voice held no surprise, no anger. Just the tired acceptance of a man who'd been running from this moment his entire life. The question was never if, only when. We could run. Where? There is no place in this territory beyond Grimm's reach. No place beyond federal authority. She sank down beside him on the creek bank, her body heavy with more than pregnancy. The weight of 40 lives resting on decisions she'd never been prepared to make. What about your original plan? The strong children, the future we were building. Some seeds take longer to sprout than others. Sometimes the ground has to be burned clean before new growth can take root. The resignation in his voice sparked something fierce in her chest. Not acceptance but rebellion, the same stubborn fire that had kept her fighting when everyone expected her to fold. No, he turned to study her face. No what? No surrender, no running, no letting Grimm win. What do you propose? We go public, make this bigger than just us, make it impossible for him to solve quietly. Tall Bear was quiet for a long moment, considering. Around them, the ranch hummed with activity as his people went about their work. Families that had found safety here. Children who'd learned to laugh again after months of hiding. That would be dangerous beyond measure. Everything we've done has been dangerous. The question is whether we face that danger on our knees or on our feet. That evening, she gathered everyone in the main barn. 40 faces stared back at her in the lamplight. Some young, some weathered, all marked by the particular exhaustion that came from being hunted. She told them about Grimm's ultimatum, about the cavalry threat, about the choice between certain destruction and probable death. I won't make this decision for you, she said finally. Anyone who wants to leave has my blessing and what supplies they can carry, but anyone who stays fights. Not just for survival, but for the right to build something new. Rosa was the first to speak. Where do we go that is safer than here? Nowhere, Tom added. We run, we die slow instead of fast. Same ending, less dignity. One by one, they declared their intention to stay. Not because they believed they would win, but because they'd found something worth losing for. A place where their children could grow up as something other than fugitives. A vision of the future that transcended the bitter divisions of the past. Tall Bear stepped forward. If we do this, we do it completely. No half measures, no backing down when the cost becomes clear. What are you suggesting? Marriage. Legal partnership. Make you Comanche by law, make me American by marriage. Force them to choose between recognizing our union or admitting their laws mean nothing. The proposal hung in the barn air thick as incense. Not romance but revolution. Not love but alliance that could reshape the legal landscape of the entire territory. The scandal alone could destroy us. We are already destroyed. The question is whether we die as victims or as symbols of something larger. Evie looked around the barn at the faces watching her. People who'd risked everything on her promise of sanctuary. Children who deserved better than a future spent running from shadows. Her hand moved to her belly where new life grew. Not just Marcus's child, but the future incarnate. The strong children Tall Bear had envisioned from the beginning. When? Tomorrow, before Grimm's deadline, before anyone can stop us. The words fell into silence that felt sacred as prayer. Tomorrow they would make their stand. Not just against Clayton Grimm, but against a world that insisted some alliances were impossible. Tonight they prepared for war disguised as a wedding, the kind that changed everything. They left the ranch at dawn, every soul committed to the impossible journey to San Antonio. 300 cattle, 40 riders, and one pregnant woman who refused to hide any longer. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as they drove the herd onto the main trail. Evie rode beside Tall Bear at the front of the drive, her condition now impossible to conceal. The loose clothing had given way to practical acknowledgement. Rosa had fashioned her a riding dress that accommodated her growing belly while maintaining dignity in the saddle. The first town they passed through went silent as a graveyard. People lined the streets watching the impossible sight. Black woman and Comanche warrior leading an integrated crew of riders who moved with military precision. Children who'd been playing in the dust stopped to stare. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores. No one spoke. The silence was judgment and amazement combined. "They have never seen anything like us," Rosa murmured, riding close to Evie's left side. "Good," Evie replied. "Time they learned something new." The cattle moved well, grass-fat and strong from months of good water. Tall Bear's people worked with quiet efficiency, their horsemanship speaking louder than any words about who they really were. The deception was over. Now came the reckoning. By the third day, they'd picked up a following. Clayton Grimm rode parallel to their course with a dozen men, never approaching but never disappearing. Shadows that promised violence if the moment presented itself. But word had spread faster than horses could carry it. At every settlement, people gathered to witness the procession. Some hostile, some curious, all riveted by the sight of boundaries being crossed in broad daylight. It was at Willow Creek that everything changed. Evie's pain started during the noon rest, sharp enough to make her gasp and double over in the saddle. Rosa was beside her instantly, hands gentle but urgent as she helped her dismount. "The baby comes early," Rosa said. "We need shelter, we need time." But time was a luxury they didn't possess. Grimm's men had closed the distance, sensing weakness. The nearest town was 10 miles ahead, the nearest doctor even farther. "We make camp here," Tall Bear decided. "Circle the wagons, protect her." "Sir," one of the younger men protested. "Out in the open, we are sitting ducks. Then we become dangerous ducks." They formed a defensive circle in the creek bottom, cattle and horses providing living barriers. Rosa disappeared into the supply wagon with Evie, preparing for birth while armed men watched the horizon for trouble. The labor was hard and fast, as if the child shared her mother's impatience with delay. Between contractions, Evie could hear the voices of her people maintaining watch, speaking in 3 languages, united by purpose that transcended blood. When the daughter finally arrived, her cries carried across the open country clear as church bells, a new voice announcing itself to a world that might not welcome her existence. Tall Bear entered the wagon as Rosa cleaned the baby, his massive frame suddenly gentle as summer rain. Without hesitation, he reached for the child. My daughter, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Our daughter. The declaration wasn't biology. It was choice. The same choice that had brought them all to this moment. Family defined by commitment rather than convenience. Outside, someone was approaching under a white flag. Evie recognized the rider before he spoke. Judge Morrison Blackwater, territorial circuit judge whose reputation for fairness had earned respect even among people who disagreed with his politics. Mrs. Copperfield, he said, removing his hat, I've been following your progress with great interest. Judge Blackwater. She struggled to sit up straighter, aware that this moment might determine everything. What brings you out here? Reports of an unusual partnership, the kind that could reshape how we think about territorial law. His words carried weight that made everyone within earshot go still. Behind him, Clayton Grimm and his men watched from a distance, clearly frustrated by the judge's intervention. What kind of reports? The kind that suggest new models for cooperation, economic integration, practical solutions to old problems. His gaze took in the mixed community, the successful cattle drive, the obvious prosperity of the operation, the kind Washington needs to see. Hope fluttered in Evie's chest, fragile as butterfly wings. Are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that territorial law needs precedent, and precedent needs people brave enough to establish it. Over the following hour, Judge Blackwater performed two ceremonies that would echo through territorial history. First, the marriage of Evangeline Copperfield to Tall Bear Walking, legally binding their partnership under territorial law. Second, the formal adoption of their newborn daughter, creating legal family ties that transcended racial boundaries. By the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, he declared, I pronounce you husband and wife, parents and partners, citizens with all rights and protections thereof. The words fell into silence thick as honey. Then Rosa began to sing, a Comanche lullaby that transformed into celebration. Other voices joined, harmonies weaving together languages and traditions into something entirely new. Clayton Grimm and his men rode away without a word. The federal authority he'd threatened evaporated in the face of legal precedent established by a territorial judge. The trap he'd spent months constructing had become a foundation for something he'd never imagined. That evening, as they prepared to resume the drive to San Antonio, Evie sat beside the creek holding her daughter while Tall Bear tended the fire. Around them, their people prepared for the final push toward a city that would either embrace their vision or reject it entirely. What do we call her? She asked, studying the tiny face that seemed to hold infinite possibility. Hope, Tall Bear said without hesitation, because that is what she represents. Hope Walking Copperfield, Evie said, testing the name. 3 cultures, 1 child, the future incarnate. The baby slept peacefully in her arms as stars emerged overhead. Tomorrow they would reach San Antonio. Tomorrow they would discover whether the world was ready for the revolution they represented. Tonight, they were simply a family resting beside water that ran clear and constant. The same water that had brought them together. The same water that would carry their story forward into whatever came next. Strong children, born from impossible alliances. The future, held in weathered hands that had learned to build instead of destroy. San Antonio rose from the Texas plains ambitious as sunrise, its adobe buildings and wooden storefronts promising commerce and possibility. Evie rode into the city with hope strapped to her chest, Tall Bear steady beside her, their cattle drive drawing crowds that lined the streets 3 deep. The market square buzzed with languages she recognized, and others that sounded foreign as birdsong. Mexican traders, German settlers, freed slaves heading west, businessmen in Eastern suits. A crossroads where the old world met the new and anything seemed possible. Their cattle sold within hours. Premium prices for grass-fed beef from ranchers who recognized quality when they saw it. But more than livestock changed hands in those negotiations. Contacts, contracts, conversations about supply agreements that would keep their integrated community profitable for years to come. Judge Blackwater had sent word ahead. Government representatives waited at the territorial office with documents that would reshape federal policy toward mixed communities. What had started as desperate survival was becoming legal precedent. "Mrs. Walking," the territorial secretary said, testing her new name, "your partnership model has attracted attention from Washington. They want to study your methods." Study meant legitimacy. Legitimacy meant protection. Protection meant the future they'd been fighting for might actually be possible. But it was the telegram waiting at the hotel that changed everything. News from home that made Evie's hands shake as she read. Clayton Grimm was dead, shot attempting to flee territorial custody after Judge Blackwater's investigation uncovered evidence of systematic land fraud spanning 3 counties. The stolen properties were being returned to their rightful owners. The conspiracy that had killed Marcus was finally exposed. "Justice," Tall Bear said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "Delayed, but not denied." That evening, they stood on the hotel balcony watching their people celebrate in the courtyard below. Rosa sang traditional songs while Tom played guitar learned from Mexican cowboys. Children ran between the adults, speaking their 3-language dialect without thought for boundaries that had once seemed absolute. Hope slept peacefully in her father's arms, unaware that she represented the future incarnate. A child who would grow up believing cooperation was natural and conflict was the aberration. "Do you ever regret it?" Evie asked. "Kneeling in my dirt that morning, starting all of this. I regret that it took desperation to bring us together. I do not regret what we built from that desperation." 6 months later, they returned to New Mexico as territorial officials, carrying government contracts and legal authority to establish their community as a model for integration. The ranch that had nearly failed became the headquarters for something unprecedented. The Copperfield Walking settlement grew beyond their wildest projections. Families arrived weekly, freed slaves from Louisiana, displaced tribes from across the Southwest, progressive whites fleeing the rigid hierarchies of eastern cities, all seeking the same thing: a place where worth was measured by contribution rather than ancestry. The town that sprouted around their ranch defied every convention of territorial development. The school taught in 3 languages. The church welcomed all faiths. The businesses operated as cooperatives where profits were shared based on labor contributed rather than capital invested. Hope's first word was agua, spoken while watching the creek that had saved them all. Her second was horse, delivered while watching her father gentle a wild Mustang with patience learned from ancestors who had lived with such animals for generations. Her third was mama, directed at Rosa, who had become grandmother to every child in the settlement. The strong children Tall Bear had envisioned were thriving. Not just Hope, but dozens of youngsters who grew up believing diversity was strength and cooperation was survival. Children who would reshape the territory simply by existing within it. Dutch had stayed through everything. His initial skepticism transformed into fierce loyalty. He now managed the livestock operation while Tall Bear handled territorial negotiations, and Evie oversaw the community's business interests. "Never thought I'd live to see anything like this," he admitted one evening, watching mixed families share dinner in the communal dining hall. "Never thought it was possible." "Most revolutions start with people doing the impossible," Evie replied, then teaching others that impossible was just another word for untried. On Hope's first birthday, the entire settlement gathered in the meadow where her parents had first found water. Judge Blackwater performed the ceremony that formally incorporated their community as an official territorial municipality, the first legally recognized integrated town in New Mexico. As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evie stood where Tall Bear had once knelt in desperation. He approached carrying their daughter, his steps confident on ground they transformed through sheer refusal to accept limitations others had imposed. "You gave me work," he said, echoing that first desperate morning. "I gave you strong children." "You gave me more than that," she replied, taking Hope into her arms. You gave me a future. Around them, their community prepared for evening. Children played between the houses while adults finished the day's work. Gardens flourished where desert had once claimed dominion. Laughter echoed where silence had once reigned. The impossible had become inevitable. The desperate had become successful. The outcasts had become pioneers. Strong children grew in strong communities built by people who understood that survival sometimes required the courage to build something entirely new. Hope gurgled happily in her mother's arms, reaching toward the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities for growth. Tonight brought the quiet satisfaction of work completed and promises kept. The kind of peace that came from knowing they'd created something worth defending, something worth expanding, something worth passing to the strong children who would carry it forward into whatever future they would build. The creek ran clear and constant beside them, carrying their story downstream toward other valleys, other communities, other people who might find courage in their example. Water always found a way forward, so did hope. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.